The genesis of Atlantis really came about when Gary, myself, Don Hahn, and Tab Murphy, shortly after the release of Hunchback of Notre Dame, got together in a Mexican restaurant to talk about future projects.
And so we met at a Mexican restaurant up in Burbank and ordered this big appetizer platter with lots of nachos and chimichanga and stuff like that. And we sat around and talked about life. You know, we talked about what we had been doing in summer and how we felt about our last film and how we'd like to collaborate again with some of the same people we had worked with before.
And that was mostly born out of a desire to kind of keep this crew that we had put together for Hunchback together. We wanted to keep them as a unit. It was such a great bunch of department heads. We had such a wonderful ease of communication. We wanted to find a project right away so that they wouldn't be sort of scattered to the four winds, you know, onto different projects.
These guys were really hot. We had you know, great art direction and layout supervision, background supervision, CGI, everything. These were like guys at the top of their game.
Before that, we had made Lion King. Before that, we had made Beauty and the Beast. And a lot of the collaborators on Atlantis had been together through those battles and through those wars and through those films together. And, you know, like colleagues and friends, we wanted to stay together to a certain degree.
That meeting at that restaurant, we sat around and it was great. We talked about the movies we grew up with, the movies we loved as kids, the Disney movies we loved as kids.
We also talked about what it felt like to see Star Wars for the first time, or what it felt like when you were in the audience when Raiders of the Lost Ark came out for the first time and you were there with your big popcorn and your, you know, chili cheese dog watching those movies, and it was a thrill ride. I don't know how else to describe it.
We were sort of lamenting the fact that they just don't make them like they used to, you know. And then we decided that we wanted to make a movie like they used to.
Looks like all our chances for survival rest with you, Mr. Thatch. You and that little book.
So we started asking ourselves, what do we want to do? You know, what kind of movies do we want to do? We've done 2 musicals that we're pretty proud of. You know, we thought we did a pretty good job of, but to be honest, you know, we've done that. Can we do something a little different? Can we kind of push Disney in a new direction? Can we push ourselves in a new direction?
And, you know, as much as we loved the animated fairy tales, there was another whole tradition of Disney movie making. These great widescreen adventure films like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Swiss Family Robinson and others that were, you know, really a great part of Disney's tradition in the 50s and the 60s. And a lot of us grew up watching those films as well and really enjoyed them. And we knew that something like that had never been done in animation before. You know, there's this entire land in Disneyland that's devoted to adventure. It's Adventureland, you know, and we'd made a couple of Fantasyland movies. And we thought, you know, wouldn't it be great to kind of turn left and make an Adventureland movie?
Immediately, the kind of movie that came to mind was the kind of movie where a bunch of sweaty guys and girls in tank tops go off and do something together as a team. Maybe because we kind of mirrored that in our real lives. Not the sweaty tank top part, but the team of people that goes off and does something together. And I think we had gathered around us on previous films this team of experts, and we want to go off and conquer something. And that was kind of our personal story, and that's somehow turned into this story about a team of experts that want to go off and discover something.
Welcome to the city of Atlantis.
At that point, Kirk and Gary were pretty sure they wanted to make a movie about explorers going into the Earth. They weren't yet sold on the idea that Atlantis was actually something that they would find.
And we thought, you know, well, what if we sort of do kind of a Dirty Dozen goes to the center of the Earth? What if we take sort of a team of hand-picked adventurers and send them on a journey into the Earth to find a lost civilization?
So it was still kind of wide open, but Atlantis, as we all kept talking about the idea, Atlantis sounded it sounded much better, like a better idea, because it had this aura of mystery and the supernatural and a lot of, you know, history associated with it. And because nobody really knows what happened, it left it open for our sort of warped interpretation.
What are they going for? What are they ultimately trying to find?
There's got to be a goal down there. Well, a big pot of gold, don't you know? But, why don't we put Atlantis down there? That would be really cool. And we don't have to actually go to the literal center of the Earth, but if with Atlantis as the goal, that would be really neat.
And so we kind of put all that together, and by the time we were done with our appetizer plate at this Mexican restaurant, we decided to head off and have an adventure of our own and make a film that was a big, fun action adventure film.
We're gonna save Atlantis, or we're gonna die trying. Don, Kirk and Gary returned with the idea that they were going to make this really big movie. It was going to be the biggest action-adventure animation they'd ever done. In fact, the only action-adventure animation they'd ever done.
Consequently, everybody believed in that idea and supported it. So there were no I know, conflicting opinions about what? No production numbers, no songs? No, not this time. Let's do a different picture.
When I first came on, you know, Gary Trousdale, one of the directors, had made up T-shirts for everybody who was on the show early on. It said, you know, Atlantis, fewer songs, more explosions. And I was like, okay, man, I'm with that.
I love action-adventure movies, so my first thought was, ooh, big action, epic adventure movie and animation, what a great thing.
So it was like jumping in with both feet and saying, okay, how can we make this good? How can we make this different?
It's part of the legacy of our great boss, Walt. I mean, that was the type of thing he set into motion. Experimentation, never duplicating what you've done in the past, trying out new things.
I think that that's healthy, and I think you need to push those envelopes, and you need to get differences between the films. And I think this film does look different than any movie that we've done. Its content and its look is very, very different.
Doing these kind of effects and these incredible digital techniques in animation had never really been done before to this extent.
I remember the first few times we saw screenings of mostly all just storyboards. I went, we can't make this film. No way, this thing is way too difficult. Even though I'm a bit of a skeptic at heart and keep saying, nah, it can't be done, I will always figure out a way to get it done because I don't know the meaning of no. If somebody says, I want to see this, I'm going to deliver that.
You're going to need a crew.
Taken care of.
Well, you'll need engineers and geologists.
Got them all. The best of the best.
Well, the easiest way to explain how we made the movie was to talk about the brain trust. We had a group of people, 8 people, 10 people, who were the brain trust for this film. So you can start with Kirk and Gary. They're the directors, the master storytellers whose vision we're all going to follow. And the team that we surrounded Kirk and Gary with was Kiran Joshi, Chris Jenkins, Ed Gertner, Lisa Keene, Dave Getz, Marlon West, Marshall Toomey. Those people became a brain trust of people that we could meet regularly with and collaborate regularly with that would execute the vision then to probably 600 people. But that has to start with a very, very small core group of people that can rally around a single vision. And what's interesting about that group of people is you might think animation's made like the Ford Motor Assembly Plant. Like you start with a chassis and that goes down and the guy puts the tires on, and by the time you get to the end, you're putting the steering wheel on and the dice on the rearview mirror and the car's done and it rolls out into the showroom. It's not really that way at all, particularly on Atlantis. I think what you'll find, and as you explore this disc and hear interviews and talk about the kinds of people that worked on this film, is a real improvisational kind of crossover between various departments. Walt Disney had this word called plussing, and it's an odd word that you don't hear out in the real world too much, but we use it here a lot. And it means that everybody that grabs the ball and runs down the field makes the movie better. So you start out with a team of story guys that do their best to storyboard the film, and then the art directors get a hold of it and make it a little better, and the layout guys make it a little better, and the effects guys a little better, and the animators a little better, and everybody takes it to a higher level until the movie becomes much, much more than any one individual could do. And that plussing kind of idea is something that was really around on Atlantis to a pretty big degree. For Atlantis, what was really important to us was to create a plausible impossible, to use an old Walt Disney term, to create a mythology around Atlantis that could make you arguably say that this actually happened. We knew to create a plausible Atlantis that we had to go out and hit the books. We had to really go out and study everything and absorb everything we possibly could on the lost continent of Atlantis.
What we learned when we started doing research, and we actually used the internet to its best advantage on this particular movie. This is one movie where we did virtually all our research at the beginning of the story from internet websites all about Atlantis and lost continents, and we found theories ranging from the very scientifically sound to like the looniest, whacked out things you could possibly
really
imagine.
Believe.
And somewhere, you know, that sort of gave us the inspiration for our story.
if you type in Atlantis as a keyword, you get a mountain of stuff back.
Since we found out that a lot of people had some awareness of Atlantis, just as a concept, but nobody really knew the story.
Plato is one of the primary sources you can go to right away and sort of start to read about Atlantis and formulate some opinions or some ideas about it.
He was the first person who put it down in writing that there was a Atlantis somewhere, and he heard it from a story from his father, who heard it from a friend. So it goes way back.
The actual legend of Atlantis, Plato describes an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that had...
which nobody really knows what that
Yeah, some people believe that's the Atlantic, other people believe it was just right in the Mediterranean. It all got a little lost in the translation.
But it was an island continent that was basically owned by Poseidon, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And his sons, the Titans, who were like the governors or the kings of Atlantis, and they governed it poorly and sank it.
Angered the gods, and the gods eventually sank it.
We researched Greek history, Roman history, native culture history, and tried to trace where Atlantis might even be. Like if we were going to go look for it today, where would it be?
There's a very convincing documentary that we saw on, one of the history channels or whatever that lays out the idea that it was Santorini, a sunken island in Greece.
The most stunning kind of comparison you can make to Santorini or Thera in Plato's accounts are that it did blow off the face of the earth one day. There was a huge volcanic eruption, and if you go there today, you can visit the island of Santorini and see the remnants of this amazing volcanic cone. And if you go down to the water's edge, you can see an archaeological ruin and walk through some of the old Minoan, or some say Atlantean streets that are still there today.
There are other things like the lost continent that would have existed in the Atlantic Ocean between, somewhere navigable between, Europe, Africa, and America, South America, which is this idea of Lemuria, that there was a whole continent that was there, because otherwise how is it that you have, for example, pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in South America? And how is it, I think there's another thing, like how is it that bananas would have been in both places if someone hadn't transported them? So that's given rise to this theory. So you tend to pick up all kinds of stuff like that.
We looked into Edgar Cayce and all his ideas about Atlantis.
It's called The Sleeping Prophet, and he had these visions.
It's from like the 1920s, and he was the one who prophesized and saw these crystals, that powered Atlantis.
He really felt and believed, almost prophesied about Atlantis being this living, breathing, spiritual force that exists today.
He went into a great deal of depth about how the Atlanteans could sort of focus their mental energy through a crystal and create a beam of destructive power, and we thought, well, that's really cool. That'd be neat to see that in animation. We found all kinds of crazy, like, hollow earth theories, just a lot of outlandish stuff about there being an entire universe underground, that exists kind of alongside of ours, and all the lost civilizations and kind of ancient masters and, mystery cults all kind of wound up down there and flourished. And we thought, we could push and pull and tweak that a little bit and let the inner Earth be the resting place of Atlantis, or at least a good chunk of Atlantis that was preserved after the disaster.
There are so many stories and groups of people who believe that Atlantis was real. So we took as many pieces as we could find from reality and combined them into what we ended up with as our Atlantis and where we found it.
Part of our ambition was to create a mythology that made what was on the screen really plausible and allow you to dig into it. So a little bit of that was getting somebody like Mark Okrand to come in and create a language that you could actually sit down and converse in an Atlantean dialect. And then we thought, well, we also need a written dialect. And for that, we went to one of our artists, his name John Emerson, who sat down one day and did a series of drawings and eventually came up with our alphabet of letters that became the Atlantean alphabet.
It can't be. It's the Shepherd's Journal. Mr. Whitmore, this journal is the key to finding the lost continent of Atlantis.
Tab Murphy was The Shepherd's Journal is his idea, the notion of the Shepherd's Journal, and this ancient book that was written by, you know, a mad shepherd, you know, 5,000 years ago that detailed his trip to Atlantis.
I mean, for me, as the writer of the story, I needed a map. I needed Milo to have a map to get to Atlantis.
One of the fun parts about making the movie is we assembled not only this mythology, but actually some of the props as though the tour to Atlantis was actually a real thing. And I always loved it when people would come into our pod where we were making the movie, and we had the Shepherd's Journal there, and they would say, "The Shepherd's Journal? You have the Shepherd's Journal?" Like we had the real thing, and well, of course, I guess we did.
But the actual physical realization of the book was a lot of different ideas were tried on.
We had our development department working on, we talked about scrolls, we talked about tablets, we talked about scrolls that had been recut and rebound into a book form.
Books with sort of unusual binding that could fold into different shapes, but ultimately it had to be kind of carried around by Milo. It couldn't be something as unwieldy as like a bunch of scrolls that he'd have to haul from place to place. It had to be something he could hold in his hand like a Bible.
And our own kind of bogus mythology of the Shepherd's Journal was that this book had traveled through history. It had been fought over, in fact, and had gone from, you know, from like barns in south of France to, you know, to the Chinese imperial courts, to, you know, to Turkey, to the Tower of London. You know, it had been all over the world.
We tried to tie the journal to various real events and real people and make it seem like something that had a life outside the movie.
So you might wonder why all this passion, time, effort to create this mythology for Atlantis, and of course we wonder that ourselves, but it's really a really simple answer. You want the audience, yes, to believe that this civilization really existed, but there's this great tradition of storytelling where, be it Plato or Edgar Cayce or all these people who have contributed to the mythology of Atlantis over the centuries, we want to do the same thing. We want to take the best of all those traditions, add to it ourselves, and then pass it on to the next generation and let them reinvent Atlantis another 100 years from now. I think a lot of people feel like we make a movie by hiring a writer who writes a script, and then we somehow go off and draw a lot of drawings, and then you go to the opening of the film. And in animation, it's not that way at all. We had a great screenwriter on the film, Tab Murphy, brilliant guy, worked on Tarzan and Gorillas in the Mist. And he was there from the earliest days to help us craft the concepts and the kind of underlayment and the spine, if you will, of the story. But then the story gets handed off to a team of story artists and certainly the directors, Kirk and Gary, to try to craft that story into something that's really unique.
Writing for animation is the most collaborative work I've ever done in my career. And you have to really have a mindset of being a team player. You sort of co-own the story with a bunch of people, other story people, artists, board artists, animators. All the way down the line, they continue to contribute to the story because the idea is to make the best movie possible.
With the story department, we're the first guys in. We're like the first guys on the beach. We're those, like in Saving Private Ryan, we're those guys that get killed. We take we take the first crack at everything. So from beginning to end, we have to visually illustrate the entire movie in comic strip form.
The editorial crew is probably the second crew on the show. We come in right after the story people. Story people come on and they start drawing their storyboards, and then we come on when they're ready to put things up basically into reels. I have nothing but a script, then I get storyboards, and then we'll record the dialogue, scratch dialogue.
Thanks for volunteering, Milo.
And then I'll cut the pictures together with the dialogue. And then we'll show it to producers, executives, make their changes. And you kind of, this process just is continuous.
The movies are constantly changing to get everything better. That's the great thing about animation, is you can continue to put it up and revise it and make it better.
And in doing so, you have a lot of successes and you have a lot of failures. You probably have more failures than successes. There's a really early piece of paper that existed on this film where I wrote down just some title ideas that were flying around. And one was Pirates of Atlantis.
The very first image on the movie was It's a picture of a pirate ship on kind of a stormy sea, and all around it are the huge arms of this big mechanical sea monster that have kind of risen up out of the water. And that was kind of our first our first visual image on the film, which kind of set the tone for the kind of movie we're going to make.
There was a part of us that were attracted to pirate movies. And at one time, there was the idea or the thought that Milo, we gave him the heritage of being a descendant of Blackbeard, the pirate.
And that got lost real early along the way and became a story about Milo going to discover his inner self and his inner tendencies towards exploration and trusting his own instincts that his grandfather imbued him with. And we lost the idea of discovering your inner pirate.
So some of the ideas we kicked around were kind of Jules Verne-ish in nature. We even were talking about maybe doing Journey to the Center of the Earth, just like an adaptation of that.
And if you've read that book, you know that there's a section of that where they visit Atlantis. They kind of pass through Atlantis.
But they don't spend any time there. It's a civilization that's dead. No one's there. And right after they get there, boom, the volcano blows up and they're gone.
Then we thought, well, let's just take the Atlantis section of that idea and turn it into a movie about a bunch of explorers that go try to find and resurrect Atlantis.
It was really about, let's just pull the cork out of our creative bottles and let it flow. And let's see what we come up with. You know, there was no concern about, oh, it's got to be 90 pages because that's what an animation feature runs. The first draft that I turned in was 155 pages long.
The very first time we got everything up on reels and screened it for people, we only had the first 2 acts, and we ran an hour and 20 minutes. And people said, gee, that's a little long, which is when we started losing. We lost just characters, entire characters, and entire sequences.
For example, the passage of time during which the explorers enter the Earth and they get to Atlantis. Now, we all knew that ultimately that would have to be a fairly truncated section of the movie. But we wrote lots and lots of sequences about what they met and the obstacles they overcame and the great, we just had a lot of fun in that area.
We had whole sequences where the submarine surfaced in the vast underground grotto and got attacked immediately by squid bats who descended from the ceiling, and they had to put up this perimeter of electric wire fence that Packard helped erect, and they turned on the high voltage and repelled the squid bats.
We had a sequence in the movie where the explorers stopped because they found these kind of hot springs to kind of soak their feet in, and it turned out that the hot springs were actually the blowholes of these giant what we called lava whales. They looked just like a landmass in kind of a sea of lava.
Okay, for the record, I never really bought off on the lava whales because, come on, man. That would have been too much of a leap of faith for me. Whales made of lava? Okay, well, wouldn't they burn up? That was a Kirk and Gary thing, so sorry guys, but, I wasn't sorry to see that one go.
Land Beast was a very fun sequence. Originally, our explorers fell down into this dark cavern, and Milo is farther away from everyone else. He's sort of rolled off by himself, and he ends up crawling through what he thinks is a tunnel, and it turns out that it's this huge creature called a land beast that rears up, and the beast is actually being hunted by a group of Atlanteans. So we had this whole hunt sequence where Milo's on the land beast, and the Atlanteans are coming after the beast, and it was great, and we all loved it, but we kind of felt like, gee, people have come to this movie, which is called Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and here we are an hour into the movie, and we're still not at Atlantis.
Mike Mignola described it as a monster parade. For the first time he saw it, he was like, it's just a big monster parade. Not that there's anything wrong with a big monster parade, but
we're big fans of monster parades, thank you very much.
But the story of Milo and his journey as a hero was getting lost in the cacophonous din of all these monster attacks.
Yeah, they were spectacular, they were fun, and they were exciting, but that was the thing. It's like, where's the human element? Where's the character element?
What do we care about? Ultimately, we decided it was more important for Milo to kind of bond with the crew and the crew to bond to him. So we decided to tell the journey to Atlantis kind of a little more on a human scale. You get all the fantastic scenery, but the story that you're really tracking is more of a human one.
The very first thing we put into production, very first thing, was the prologue of the movie, which told the story about a series of Vikings navigating the North Atlantic using an ancient document called the Shepherd's Journal.
Or Atlantis.
And they encountered a giant sea monster who ate their boat, and the only thing left at the end of the sequence was the Shepherd's Journal floating on the sea.
We wanted to give the journal a sense of history. We wanted to make it feel like it was this ancient document that had been sought out for centuries.
We wanted to start the movie off exciting, you know, kind of start it off with a bang, and you know, let the audience know you're in for something that you're not necessarily used to in a Disney film.
It was a spectacular sequence, so much so that we actually animated it and colored it and cut it into the movie. And we watched the movie one day, and John Sanford, who's the head of our story department and a brilliant storyteller, said, you know, you're probably going to fire me because this is going to cost a lot of money, and you'll hate me for saying this, but by the time we get to Atlantis, I really don't care about Kida, and I really don't care about the Atlanteans, because it's taken me 40 minutes to meet them, and it's like a whole new movie when we get to Atlantis, and I don't care about their story at all.
And he said, cut the Viking prologue and start the movie with Kida. And we said, there was a long pause in the room, and we said, we're listening. And he said, Kida's a little girl. She witnesses the destruction of Atlantis, but it's from the perspective of a 4-year-old girl. And we went, you know, again,
Let us go home and think about this.
pause, because in our hearts, we knew he was right.
And Gary Trousdale went home that night, and in a little spiral binder, he sketched out in these little thumbnails of what that beginning could be.
Suddenly, the whole thing pulled together. Suddenly,
it was more satisfying on a number of levels, because you did get a backstory of Kida. You felt, you know, a little bit of her history and a little bit of what she's been going through. You got a glimpse of Atlantis. You got to look at it in its heyday. You got to look at what it used to be, and it still started with a bang, because we got to blow it up and flood the world. So.
Exactly. So it was still an action sequence. It was still about really starting the movie off with a bang, as it were. But now there was an emotional core to it. There was a little girl who you were following through this, and she had this, you know, terrible experience where she sees her mother lifted up into the sky, and that's something that could pay off for us later in the movie.
To the point where now in the story, 40 minutes in, when Kida comes back and lifts up her mask, in screenings we sit in the back and we always laugh because everybody in the audience goes, "Oh, that's the little girl." Everybody whispering, "That's." And it's all because John Sanford came in that one day and said, "You're going to kill me, but there's a better idea." And he was right. So we cut the Viking prologue, and we hope you enjoy it on the disc. There's always a debate in retrospect when you see all these sequences of, well, wouldn't that have been a better idea, or wasn't that a cool sequence, why didn't you use that? Ultimately, it comes down to a director's vision. Yes, all these discarded sequences have some value to them, or we wouldn't have storyboarded them and put them up on the screen in the first place. But ultimately, the director has to stop one night and say, you know what? It's a cool sequence, it just doesn't belong in this story. There's 50,000 ways you can tell the story about a bunch of explorers that make it to Atlantis. What's the most compelling? What's the most emotional? What's the way that we really want to relate to the characters on the screen? That's the story to tell, and anything that's not on that spine has to be shaved off and thrown away, and you just stick with those core ideas that belong in the movie. Imagine Lion King without Africa. Imagine Mulan without China. Imagine Ariel without her under the sea. And imagine Milo on a stage by himself with nothing behind him. And that gives you a sense of what this team of people do. There are people who are layout artists, background painters, scene planners, effects artists that have to create the world that these characters will inhabit, and it has to be as plausible as Africa and China and this beautiful undersea environment in Little Mermaid. You have to believe, in fact, that Atlantis really does exist. Layout's a tough task because you're not only the set designer, but you're also the cinematographer. And Ed Gertner, who is our layout supervisor on Atlantis, is just that. He has a great sense of stages and settings and how to compose things around the characters, but he's also a really brilliant cinematographer. He's able to take the camera, in this case the virtual camera, the animated camera, and move it around to make you feel like you're really part of that scene.
I came in early because of the CinemaScope on this picture. I had to sell it to the people here because it had been a long time since we had done any widescreen format, and they had looked at it for other pictures, but found it maybe not viable for them at the time, and I felt that Atlantis action-adventure should have been widescreen.
The perception of producing a bigger image for the screen is that you're going to have to draw everything bigger. Now, if you have to draw everything bigger, you've got bigger size sheets of paper, you have bigger desks, maybe you have bigger animators to animate, I don't know. There was certainly talk about bigger rooms. There was talk about, you know, how do we fit all these new desks, these new discs that we're going to have to create for the paper. And I realized very early on that there was just such a terrible misconception.
We did a little experiment and said, well, a normal screen is this big. And so you could argue that the film is going to be 30% larger, but you could also argue, well, the ratio could be 30% smaller. You could actually take top and bottom off of it and get the same ratio. And that was the argument that prevailed. And in the end, it wasn't 30% more expensive. It was actually true that we worked on, technically, on smaller paper with smaller backgrounds because the style allowed it.
So on Atlantis, we had the ability to make longer scenes because there was more space for the character to walk in. When we first started this too, we looked at David Lean movies, we looked at Indiana Jones, any widescreen picture that we could get a hold of that was famous, that we all liked, and found that there were similarities, no matter who was the director or the style of the picture.
I mean, movies of this type, stories of this type have always been told in that format because stories that are epic in nature seem to kind of demand that sort of really
canvas to
yeah,
paint on.
exactly, that kind of canvas, that really sort of immersive feel to bring you into this fantasy world. A lot more action can be contained on the screen sort of at one time, and you just get these wonderful panoramic vistas of these alien landscapes that really make you feel like you're there.
Background painters are wonderful storytellers because color has such a strong emotional response to us as human beings. When we see a color, when we see red, we feel passion or anger. When we see blue, we see peace or romance. All those things can go into a background painting. So it's not just technique, it's not just the obvious colors, it's also the emotional colors of what's in a scene. And so background painters in that way are wonderful storytellers that contribute to the emotion of the scene.
Lisa Keene, our background supervisor, was having this problem, or she was in this quandary about how to treat the film overall, color-wise.
My whole world is based on the color of what that environment is. So one of the biggest challenges I had was, what does this environment look like, and how do we create light down here? You know, how do they breathe? How do they get their water? How does all this happen?
Lisa went away and thought and painted and thought and came up with an entire working model of the Atlantean ecosystem.
You know those little spheres that you'll see in some of those New Age stores, and it's a whole ecology. It's like a little glass bubble, and it has water in it, has a little plant, has a little fish. Well, the whole ecosystem works within itself. And that's kind of where I launched from, where you've got this, basically a bubble that's sitting under the ocean. If that bubble were covered by Earth, and this is where we had some artistic license. The crystal is the catalyst. This is the thing that's still operating in Atlantis and drawing a certain amount of water that brings the water up into Atlantis and creates the waterfall and the lake, if you will, that you see, and that's drawing off of the ocean. And there was also the concept of this being very near to the Earth. So we might have some magma coming up from the bottom. We would have perhaps a lava flow in there. Now, if you have that bubble and you have a lava flow and you have water, you can create steam, which in turn waters the plants, which in turn create oxygen. So you can start to build an environment in which you might be able to have life. So that crystal is what is so important. So when they actually steal the crystal and take it from Atlantis, they realize their world is over. That's when the lava becomes more intense and the whole world becomes red. And it's a struggle to get that crystal back to Atlantis, to get that equilibrium back on track for survival.
We never have a character go, look at it and go, why, this must be like a giant garden pump. The water is pumped up. We just thought,
do it.
We just do it. And we thought that it would just give the whole place a little more credibility. Even if a character doesn't stop and explain it for the audience, the fact that we knew what it was and the artists knew how it worked just enabled them to believe in it more.
When you go to make a film like Atlantis, you really want a seasoned professional to kind of jump in and create your special effects, because it is a toy store full of opportunities. And you know, we had no seasoned professional, oddly, on Atlantis. We had a gentleman named Marlon West who turned out at the end of the movie to be a brilliant seasoned professional.
I got this visit from Don Hahn, the producer, came to visit me in my little office that I had at the time, and asked me if I wanted to work on Atlantis, and that was the first time I was actually going to supervise something, and I knew it was a big show, and it was pretty daunting to me being a first-time supervisor, and he showed me the show reel at the time. I kind of took a look at it, and I saw this movie with like sea monsters and lava, literal fireflies setting fire to things, and I started looking around my room like for candid camera cameras or something, because I was like, these guys are trying to put one over on me, but they were serious. And this is a really big effects movie. So it was a big job. But when someone asks me, what's effects animation, and my kind of catch-all definition is everything that moves on the screen except the characters themselves. The water surfaces, digital bubbles in the film, as well as like traditional bubbles, and everything else that's actually moving around them, steam, mist, clouds, all of that kind of comes under the realm of effects. But the cool thing about Atlantis is it has effects. That the effects department are doing. Energy zaps, machine gun fire, and all that kind of stuff. Things that people in a live action film would associate with being an effect as well. So it's like it's the same thing. So that's very satisfying when I'm trying to explain what I do to someone. It's special effects, and this movie's full of them.
This wasn't Marlon West's movie, as far as I'm concerned. This was his special effects gift to the world.
Without scene planning, animation is just a bunch of drawings. It's just a stack of drawings on a table. What scene planning does is takes that stack of drawings on a table and turns it into a plausible shot for a motion picture.
That's the idea of scene planning, is making all these pieces that make up a scene fit so harmoniously together that that you get kind of that tingle in your spine sometimes when you see certain scenes.
You look at a sequence like the Leviathan battle, where you have a three-dimensional animated articulated object like the Leviathan or the submarine interacting with objects like Rourke barking orders or painted backgrounds sliding by. A scene planner has to take all those elements and work them like beautiful ballet to make sure that they seem plausible and actual in a real world that our movie exists in.
If we've done our job really well, you don't notice camera work, you don't notice these pieces. You think of it as that environment existed, just like that. Somebody drew it all together as that one piece, and it's all just working, almost like you were a live action camera, just off on a location shot, and you shot it exactly how it is. One thing that I've kind of learned about Kirk and Gary as directors is they like to end their film with a big bang. They love to do these long pullbacks, and we tried it on Hunchback, and we ran into limitations with the computer. And I really felt the greatest challenge that we faced was we had such a huge pullout, and the directors wanted to see depth in that pullout. So they wanted to see what we refer to as multiplaning, but the computers didn't want to behave nicely.
It's the most complex shot we've done in, the 100-year history of the Walt Disney Company because of the amount of levels and the amount of ambition for that scene.
It was a big challenge because the artwork in there is 2D.
So think of Kida and Milo as they're walking up the stone giants are probably about 6 inches big, the characters themselves. They're playing on a set that is about 16 inches big. And as we continue pulling out, we literally go from the equivalent of this 16-inch piece of paper to an 18,000-inch piece of paper. But each piece of paper that made this set is literally 24 inches big or smaller. So you're creating this set that doesn't belong together at all. They're all a bunch of separate pieces that looks like it's living harmoniously together. And that's where scene planner comes in. Scene planner makes that all happen. And we don't do it alone. Scene planning is never a job of a solo department. Scene planning really is a service for all these different departments, and it's really getting small pieces from all these different departments that brings this scene together and creates the final shot of what everybody thought just happened.
All this collaboration, all this kind of plussing process of getting the movie as good as it can goes towards one thing, and that's the audience. We want you to go to the theater and sit down with your popcorn and your family and have the lights go down and have an experience that you haven't had before, to be able to transport you to a place you haven't had before. We realize that as artists, it's really difficult to do by ourselves. I can't make that film myself. Kirk can't, Gary can't, Ed can't, Lisa can't. But together, we're stronger than each of us. Together, that kind of collaboration, that kind of team effort that we have makes something on the screen that is really unique, and it's always going to be viewed by our audience and by each other as this collective process, this collaboration that brought Atlantis to life. A lot of our movies, when you look at them, are based on very familiar designs. If you could arguably say Beauty and the Beast is like a moving children's book, or you could say Sleeping Beauty is moving medieval tapestries. At the beginning of Atlantis, we kind of said, what if it's a moving comic book? What if you actually could step into the pages of a comic book and feel the design and the angularity and the action and the graphic quality of a comic book, but feel it as a spectator, as someone that was strapped in alongside the explorers and could actually step into that world. And that's what the design world of Atlantis is. And I think Dave Getz and our art direction team on the film was at the forefront of trying to create a visual experience that makes you feel like you're sitting in the middle of an environment as opposed to watching an environment.
This movie was a little different than movies I've worked on in the past because rather than necessarily sticking from the visual development people that we had inside the studio, we actually hired freelancers from the outside who were working in the live action business. We call it look outside the gene pool. It's to get a group of people working on it who just bring a different design sense and you know, something that we might not have seen before in the animation world.
And there were 4 gentlemen that did that as production designers in this film. Matt Codd, who had worked on films like Men in Black and some of the Jurassic Park films and others, came in and designed the Leviathan and the submarine. And Jim Martin, who's also known for a lot of his work in some of the most, the biggest special effects titles of the last decade, came in and helped us design elements of the submarine and the subpods and a lot of the vehicles. Ricardo Delgado, who's known primarily for his brilliant comic work and his work in film, helped us design a lot of the sets of Atlantis and the environments and the caves and the exotic world of the Atlanteans. And then lastly, Mike Mignola.
Well, Mike is a great comic book artist, and both Gary and I have been comic book fans from way back, and we kind of discovered his comics at around the same time, and really enjoyed reading them and love the artwork and love the stories.
He's done a number of comic books. The most famous or notorious is his Hellboy series, which Kirk and I are both huge fans of. We recognize the style early on as something that would fit in with the kind of thing we were doing.
So we're really drawn to Mike's work because of its very high contrast style, very bold use of black, and a kind of limited color palette, and we were drawn to that. It just felt appropriate for the movie, and rather than just sort of take his comics as an inspiration, we decided to just go to the man himself and get Mike Mignola on the phone. Unfortunately, he was he was willing and able.
I just can't get over the fact that these guys even knew who I was. And when I first came up here, there were these big boards set up. There were panels from whole pages from various comics I'd done, and notes all over them explaining how to draw like me. Mike Mignola does this, Mike Mignola does this. And the woman who did these things, I actually had to ask her what some of the notes meant. I didn't know how to draw like me, it's just the way I draw.
He came down and not only contributed a lot of great drawings that were the springboard for a lot of the big visual images in the story, but he also had a great story sense, being a writer and artist himself, and writing scores and scores of comic book stories. He just has a really, really fast and sharp creative mind, and came up with you know, tons of ideas in the course of many story meetings. A lot of them, you know, found their way into the movie.
I'm used to doing a lot of talking. I'm not used to anybody listening. And I'm certainly not used to anybody listening to what I have to say and going off and making a movie out of it. So it's been pretty interesting.
When you look at the movie, and as the directors will tell you, a lot of what you're seeing are story ideas and concept ideas, like flying stonefish that shoot lightning bolts out of their mouth, or giant stone guardians that come up to save the day at the end of the film, that are right out of Mike Mignola's hand. And I think what was powerful about Mike, and certainly Matt and Ricardo and Jim, is their ability to create another world and be kind of visionaries for us in a visual sense. And then you take a guy like Dave Getz, whose job it is to pull all that together, and all that kind of ingredients, and bake a beautiful cake that the audience will want to eat. So it doesn't look like, you know, here's a piece of chocolate and a piece of lemon meringue pie here and all these different flavors. He has to bake a cake that sits together and feels like one movie, and that's the genius of Dave Getz.
The main design theory for me kind of revolves around the opposition of these two cultures. So on the one hand, you have the intruding explorers in their clanking, smoke-spewing, noisy World War I era industrial. Their philosophy is all reliant on technology, basically. And they're coming down and they're invading these Atlanteans who, their whole world is built around this mysticism or magic. And everything about them is really organic.
So we would have this organic magic kind of crystal-based technology versus this world of you know, pre-World War I. And you can look at books and you can look at photos and you go on the internet for things like that, but really, for something like that, nothing really beats being, you know, being like right next to the objects.
The interiors of the submarine were based on 2 trips, not only to a harbor in Los Angeles, but to a harbor in Baltimore to look at old period submarines.
And we actually got to go into the submarine and kind of crawl through it and imagine what that would be like to be in an environment that enclosed.
Cramped is the word that comes immediately to mind. You're talking about very compact, you know, men and machinery. It's more like a big wad of machinery that has a little hole bored through it that, you know, that men may pass through and barely cohabitate in. I mean, it's truly amazing. And, you know, I can imagine being underwater for weeks in one of those things.
We also had the good fortune to travel to Maryland, to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, because it's like the nation's largest collection of armored vehicles, going all the way back to World War I.
We were able to crawl into these tanks and, you know, look through their gun sights and you know, kick the doors and slam the tires.
It was the crudeness and the absurdity of the technology, and yet the complete faith in the technology, that made it a really interesting time period. I think the only era that could take place in was 1914, and these field trips help us immerse ourselves in that era.
It was like rich material for us to like just, okay, you know, we can
pull a bit from here, pull a bit from there, and kind of synthesize that into the design of the explorer's technology.
It was earthy, it was gritty, it was pre-war, it was all of those things, as opposed to Atlantis, which was watery, it was more ethereal, it was a cooler environment, it was warmer, it was rounder, it had a very different feel than above land. Obviously there's no place to go such as that for Atlantis, because it's a very made-up world. However, what we did do was create the umbilical cord from above land to Atlantis, which was the caverns and the caves. So we did some work with the Carlsbad Cavern folks, who very graciously took us and showed us some of the more interesting environments in the caves, and some of them were quite hairy.
Okay, kids, don't try this at home. Go down this hole in the ground out here in the middle of nowhere.
There was one cave we went into, it was called Spider Cave. And as we all kind of shimmied our way down into it, and gee, why is it called Spider Cave? The guy says, just look above you.
First thing you do is you look up, and the place is covered with spiders and bugs. It's like a scene out of a Spielberg movie. And I'm not bothered by spiders and bugs, but you know, when they're about 3 inches from your head and there's a lot of them, and they're big and they look like they're hungry, you know.
You don't want to touch anything. Stay as low to the ground as you can.
Those trips, aside from a bonding experience where we take our crew out and throw them together in a cave 800 feet under the ground, creates a certain esprit de corps between your filmmakers. It also creates a real sense of the topic that you're facing. We're pursuing life deep in the center of the earth, and it's fascinated science fiction writers for centuries. The idea of exploration in a world that we've never known that's right beneath our feet. And that was something that was so apparent when you get down there and you find out, well, the big room at Carlsbad Caverns is 13 football fields across. That's huge. And that makes you start to believe that you can sustain a whole civilization underground that's based on the elements that you have available underground, like the warmth from lava or the water dripping from the ceiling, and create an ecosystem that's completely different than our own, but that exists completely for the servicing of Atlantis and that culture underground.
One of the things that happened right away in the creation of this movie that Kirk and Gary wanted was that Atlantis not look like the expectation you had. And I think most people in their heads have kind of a Greco-Roman view of Atlantis.
The kind of cliche version of Atlantis.
The 1950s Atlantis, the aquarium toy look.
Yeah, the aquarium toy look. It's like crumbled Greek columns underwater. That's not what we wanted. We wanted something that would give our Atlantis, you know, its own identity.
In fact, in the style guide, there's a little picture of a Greek temple with a cross crossed out. You know, it's just not where we're going with this. We looked at Mayan architecture, styles of kind of ancient, unusual architecture from around the world, and the directors really liked the look of Southeast Asian architecture. And if you think of Angkor Wat in Cambodia as kind of generally the idea, the model, you have these kind of beehive-shaped towers. There's a very kind of particular characteristic to the stuff. That became the basis for, you know, our physical appearance of Atlantis.
There was the idea that Atlantis was kind of the cradle civilization or the mother civilization, and that other styles, whether they were South American pyramids or the temples of India or even, you know, the more Western stuff like the Greek and Roman architecture, all kind of branched out of this.
So if you take and deconstruct architecture from around the world into one architectural vocabulary, that's what our Atlantis looks like. You might think, why not go out and grab a camera and film an expedition to Atlantis, and you'd have the movie. Why mess with all this design and kind of taking the audience through with these beautiful design frames and scenes? And I would argue, well, that's what animation's about. You can start with a blank piece of paper and not only take an audience on a journey to Atlantis, but pull their eye around the screen and make them feel things with color and shape and texture with a pencil and a piece of paper and a paintbrush. You can create a world that is fantastic and you've never experienced before. There's more digital production in Atlantis: The Lost Empire than in any movie we've ever really done.
I think a lot of it just depends on what the demands of the story are. For instance, when the submarine or the creature the submarine encounters, they're huge, they're very detailed, they're very geometrical in their design. It would be really time-consuming and difficult to do all that kind of stuff by hand. Whereas if you build a digital model...
Or you'd have to cut a lot of corners.
Yes.
So with digital models of both, we can show a lot more.
So to do that in our visual development process, we brought the digital production people in to work side by side with us to help develop the movie with digital production in mind.
What are the types of digital elements that end up in the movie? You can pretty much classify them into like 4 categories. First is the digital characters. Then we have the vehicle effects. On top of that, we had effects like what we call the organic effects. And then the 4th digital element that we did was 3D environments. Our goal is to not only build this digitally and make it work, but the idea is that once we go into production, we can crank out a lot of scenes.
A lot of people don't realize it when you see the movie, but there's actually a lot of character animation in the movie that's done digitally by our computer graphics animators. Characters like the stone giants at the end of the movie or the Leviathan are all animated in a computer.
The Leviathan is the gatekeeper to Atlantis. He's there to keep them out. The directors believed it was half machine and half, as I call it, lobster, crab, shark mixture. And it was a beast, literally, inside the computer as well as outside. Essentially, before we start any character, we need a drawing from front, side, and back. And from those drawings, the modeler takes it and puts it into the computer. It was a pretty well-built model and rig, and it was heavy just because there was hundreds of controls on it without even bringing in the face into it, which would have added another 50. The modeler in a 3D space inside the computer, using points and surfaces, shapes and molds it just like a sculptor would outside the computer with his hands. But we're using like the mouse and tools that the computer software gives you. And then you have the color and lighting people, you know, make it beautiful. It's exactly the same as what a traditional animator does. It's just in the computer. The stone giants were the protectors of the city. When we were animating them, they were just sort of like a human being, but we would just scale them up and make them move really slowly to get the effect that they were much larger than the other characters in the shots. The Tonys are really the henchmen, or all the guys that get all the work done for Rourke and all those people. But you never see them, they're only in cars, you know, or walking around in the background. They're sort of the unsung heroes of getting the main crew down to Atlantis. They're a generic model. We had like different hats and different mustaches and that we would swap in and out depending on the scenes, just to make it look like there was more of them. So we kind of faked it.
And of course, another way to use computer graphics is with special effects. The visual effects artists use computers to create, for example, that amorphous glob of crystals with the orbiting rune stones around it is all animated and conceived, in fact, with the idea of computer graphics in mind.
What we were able to do digitally was make it have all these layers, you know, these three crystals, orbs kind of rotating around, and then there's like a sphere around them. Then it's emitting bright light, so when you look in through it, it's like looking into the sun. You got the crystal energy crackling around the crystal, and when it shoots out of the Leviathan, it's basically the same.
It shoots a crystal energy blast. And the idea behind the crystal energy blast is that it has its main core, but then around the core there's a lot of this crackle effect. And if you look at that crystal real carefully, that same theme is echoed there. There's this Atlantean crackle.
The shields, the cover Atlantis, they were also done digitally. So then, you know, it had a very energy kind of crackle kind of that moved around it as well.
That crackle effect, that's really to integrate with the Mignola style. When we look at Mignola's comic books like Helga and all, you'll see that there's a lot of these crackle effect. There's like lots of explosions with negative holes.
The other way we use computer graphics is in environments and sets. We're able to use techniques that combine cinematography, deep canvas, into these really sweeping camera moves that use the computer to create a sense of environment, that you're actually flying through a part of the environment.
We have a hard time moving the camera through things. So the advent of the computer is helping us be able to get more what we call Z-plane into space.
The opening of the film, we wanted it to be very intense, to get a lot of emotion out of the camera work, so that way you could put a fear into the audience of what these people flying the Armada were feeling. We purposely decided to make it 3D so we could get a lot of the banking that you would feel if you were on a roller coaster.
The part that we actually fly through the environment with our characters is basically a 3D animated wireframe that we then go on and paint over the surface. What it does is it creates an environment that looks hand-painted but is 3D.
The tunnels in the Leviathan submarine chase, we built a tube, flew the camera through it, and then had background painted digitally in their deep canvas system. I would be interested to see if anybody could really tell the difference between the 2D and the 3D layouts, because we mixed them. It's very hard to tell. We hid the magic.
A very big challenge early on was to produce a look that really fitted into this 2D environment, and not just a 2D environment even in our traditional sense, but a 2D environment that's composed of comic book images.
There was a great test we did early on where a staff car, like a vehicle, drove up and drove over the foot of one of the stormtroopers, and he hops off the screen. It was a little gag scene, but it was meant as a very serious exploration about how the look of the film could develop. The ambition was to try to not make 2D traditional character-drawn animation and computer graphics look like they're from two different films, but rather make the computer graphics fit into the world we had created.
It's definitely a shotgun marriage. It's something that took a bit of doing at the head of this, because a lot of our 3D guys come from the live action world. It took a lot of arm twisting to convince them that we want this to look like cartoons. We want it flattened out.
One of the challenges was to get a software developed that would put a line around the edges of all of our vehicles, and then just developing what they call the shader, which is the way that the actual coloring of a 3D surface looks. In other words, does it have texture? Does it have gradations on it? Does it have interesting kind of painted maps put on it? In our case, no. We decided to make it look as much like a cell-painted object as possible.
You don't need to put all the bells and whistles on anyway, because movement conveys that extra dimension that you'll be missing.
The sub-drop shot was an interesting shot in the picture because we had to move the camera past the bubble where Milo is standing. And to do that is such a tricky shot.
Whenever you have a moving 3D object and, you know, and you have to draw a 2D character on that, it gets really hard.
We have a three-dimensional sub, so it's definitely generated in a whole different environment. We had two-dimensional characters, which was Milo. Once you take these two worlds and you go to composite them together, they move against each other. It almost looks like buzzing or this kind of static type noise that you get, and then that's distracting to the audience. So what we ended up doing, we ended up taking Milo and placing him in that 3D environment. The drawing itself is always at one size. It never changes sizes. It's the computer that then places it. In the case of the sub dropping, the sub is miles and miles away at the start of the shot, comes right through camera's eye, and then as he comes through camera, he does his little head turn and moves his body, and then goes miles away at the end of the shot. And it's the computer that's doing the changing of the size of Milo. So those two environments, a two-dimensional character and a three-dimensional sub, live harmoniously together, and they really feel like they're all one set, even though they're not. That scene would have been terrible had you seen Milo chattering around the whole time in the bathysphere as he passed by, but now he's completely locked hands on it, and it looks great.
We knew that the traditional hand-drawn animation and the digital animation had to exist hand in hand for Atlantis to be a success. The goal of all this digital production in the film was not just to grandstand, it was not just to say, oh, look at all the cool things we can do. It was really to make the movie visceral and exciting and make you feel like you were on this kind of high-powered journey to Atlantis. And of course, the thing you learn at the end is it really doesn't matter if an artist comes into work and picks up a pencil or picks up a mouse and a keyboard. It's really the art on the screen that matters. Computers don't do a thing. It's the artists, the great artists, that come in and use those computers to create wonderful production on the screen that helps the audience feel like they're just engrossed in the film. In an animated film, there's no ambient sound. You know, there's no guy in the studio recording what animators sound like because, you know, it's like a lot of slurping coffee and flipping pages. So we really have to go to somebody who can create worlds for us, and no one better than Gary Rydstrom.
Milo, jump! Right now! Yeah!
If you were to watch an animated film with just the dialogue, it would seem very strange. There's no weight to the characters, there's no other sounds. So, but that's the fun part about doing sound effects for an animated film, because that entire world has to be created. So you can create not only from scratch, but you can create what you want and what you want the sound to sound like.
We wanted somebody who could create a whole world for us that would sound like Earth, but not quite. We talked about the difference between how Atlantis would sound and how the Explorers would sound, which sounds odd, but so that the Explorers' vehicles were all very mechanical sounds, very hard sounds, whereas he tried for the Atlantean vehicles and for Atlantis itself a much more organic kind of sound, and just kind of wed those two together.
That entire world has to be created around the images and the dialogue to make it believable for an audience. You really think these people are walking around and handling objects and flying stonefish and getting in a sub and driving cars and all the other stuff. We have this wonderfully clean palette to work from. The movie's got plenty of big moments or traditional explosions and crashes and submarine chases and little submarines and torpedoes and just giant rocks falling. Then on top of that, film has, you know, giant stone Atlantean leviathans that chase the submarine. So it's a combination of a living thing, but it's also made of, like a lot of things, Atlantis, from a kind of a crusty, rocky material.
What is it, a pod of whales?
Bigger.
It sounds metallic. Could be an echo off one of the wrecks.
Do you want to do my job? Be my guest.
So we would play with all sorts of ceramics and pottery and toilet lids and really literally all sorts of that kind of stuff to make unique sounds for those Atlantis things. I guess it would be science fiction, although it's really more fantasy. I didn't want to have anything that would sound electrical or part of our world for the Atlantean. I mean, really the basic sound for, say, the flying stonefish, that musical sound, was a recording that I made of a truck driving by. And so a lot of the Atlantean sounds come from these type of pure things. That, crystal harmonicas, you're rubbing your finger on a champagne glass and getting that pure glass kind of ringing sound, become the energy sci-fi sounds for Atlantis.
Launch sub-pods!
The little subs that are launched from the big sub, and they whip around, they have these tiny little motors. We used a water pick for that, just to that little kind of water pick motor. So yeah, you do, just sitting at home, hear a water pick say, in your head, sub. So it's a funny life. You know, a lot of the stone giant stuff, just that sound of the plates of stone that really make it stone giants, is really just taking a ceramic pot from the garden store and taking it in here and scraping it on itself or rattling it or doing things like that until you find an interesting sound.
All that someone like Gary Rydstrom has to work with are the elements of dialogue, music, and effects. It sounds so simple, but it can be really detractive and annoying if the sound pulls you out of the story. One of my favorite moments in the film is actually completely silent, and it's when this giant wall of lava comes in and takes over the city and hardens over the top of Atlantis, and the entire soundtrack comes down to absolutely nothing. And you can hear a pin drop in the theater when that happens. And so sometimes sound isn't sound, it's the absence of sound. And great musicians will tell you the same way. It's sometimes the notes are equally as important as the rests.
It's experimenting, it's having fun. A lot of my job early on is really literally goofing around, playing around with sounds, with props, and manipulating them in funny ways and seeing what you get. And when you get that unique little bit of sound, then you take that and run and cut it up and use it in the movie.
Music in animation is everything. You know, especially at the Disney Studios, it has always been a centerpiece of all of our films. And when you think back of the movies that we've done, like Bambi and Dumbo, you remember the music. And Atlantis is really no different. It's not a musical. Nobody breaks into song and sings. But in every way, it kind of is a musical.
On Atlantis, because we didn't have songs, it was going to be very important to us to get a composer who could really give us that huge sense of adventure and wonderful themes. And, well, we kind of quickly got down to James Newton Howard.
When you're really lucky, you get to work with a composer like James Newton Howard. And when, you know, this is our second of 3 films in a row we're doing with him, because he's doing Treasure Planet, which comes out a year from now, Atlantis now, and did Dinosaur last year.
In the case of Atlantis, I've approached it largely as a live-action film in terms of all the sensibilities. And in that regard, they are exactly the same for me in terms of the initial inspiration, the initial ideas, in terms of what the music's going to feel like and what it's going to be like.
I've always thought James Newton Howard should get story credit on our films because he transports you musically through several idioms. In other words, he's taken us from Washington, D.C. and a very symphonic approach to music and transported us to a culture that's never existed before by inventing a musical voice for Atlantis.
Let's do one more time, and let's have Jim Thatcher play out his horn line just a fraction now. Split the difference.
What I'm trying to do is establish a difference between the surface world and the Atlantean world. There's a number of ways of doing that. The way we chose, or we talked about early on, was sort of referencing to a very distant extent gamelan, which is the Indonesian orchestral sound. It's made up of a lot of tuned chimes and bells and gongs, and it's a wonderfully rich tradition of music. I think the idea is to combine sounds in such a way, juxtapose it against the picture in such a way that the totality of what you experience is a unique and wonderful event, much more so than any individual sound.
Composers in Hollywood don't get a lot of chance to write scores like this. There's some big moments where we carved out time with no dialogue and these beautiful scenics and just said, this is a moment that we can't express in words. You have to take it. As storytellers, we can only take the audience so far. We can only kind of lead the horse to water. And what James can do with his music is he can make the horse drink. He can really take you all the way and have that emotional quality resonate with the audience. You really feel like he's tapping into something that's really primal in us, that really helps us appreciate the emotion of the story.
If you're a composer in an animated film, you really have to assume the role of a team player. I enjoy that. I really enjoy the feeling of sort of being a team.
What you get with James is not just a guy who's going to do your score for you. You get a partner. So he comes in very early with us on the movie. Over a year ahead, he's with us creating themes, writing themes, watching the story as it develops. Animation can be very inviting for someone like that. And when you get a composer like James who has such an expansive idea in his head about what film music can be, he becomes a real partner. And the marriage of the sound of the movie and his score is so spectacular, sometimes you can't even separate the two. That is his musical depth, but more than that, it's his emotional depth and his willingness to partner that makes him so great.
Some people describe the process of bringing a character to the screen like a relay race. First, you start out with character designers. The character designers are trying to give a sense of the possibilities. What are the infinite possibilities from a blank piece of paper of what that character might look like?
What I liked about this film was that I started off really early in this film, and they had Gene Gilmore's drawings, which were really dynamic and fun, and drawings from Mike McNola. He did some fantastic drawings. And Chen Yi Chang had done some really marvelous stuff with the hands too and designs, and he brought it back to a lot more sculpted designs in the way that he drew the hands, the faces, and things like that too.
The next part in the process, this kind of relay race of character design, is seeing if the drawing can move. It may look great on a piece of paper, but if a supervising animator can't take it and move it around to act and perform and dance and run and jump, then it's worthless. Now the animator has a chance to breathe life into the character, that life-giving process of animation where a character goes from a still drawing on a piece of paper to a living, breathing being.
Then once you've got that pretty well defined, you go into actually animating some scenes where you get the acting down. And that's, to me, that's the main thing. An animator is an actor.
You direct them just like you would direct any actor, except that the acting all comes out from their brain and from their heart all the way down their arms, you know, right through the tips of their fingers.
You don't necessarily have to be a good draftsman. You do have to be a good entertainer. You do have to understand emotion and personality and how to equate that to movement and mass. It's a very, very strange combination of disciplines.
As an animator, not only myself, but everybody that's in animation, they study acting. Drawing is only half of the equation. Acting is the other half.
That's what's great about animation. You're not limited by your body type or your appearance. If you can draw it, you can be it. I don't really worry so much about making very clean drawings. As I said, I try to work as clean as possible so that my ideas get communicated. But cleanup, their job is then to take my rough drawings and clean them up, basically.
What we do in cleanup is we take the rough animation and we do the cleanup line drawings that you see on the screen. So the drawings you see on the screen are done by the cleanup department based on what these wonderful animators have acted out. Now, the challenge to that is there's not just one main character. We had a whole crew of characters.
The individual characters, they were cast with as much care and precision as Whitmore would cast each one of the roles in the Expeditionary Force.
The idea of Milo was easy. The little nerdy guy that just, couldn't do anything right but was very intelligent. Everybody knows somebody like that.
Milo and Atlantis has a very special place in my heart. I mean, not only after being in the business for almost 30 years, it's like this is probably the closest time I've ever come to animating a self-portrait. There's a lot of me in it. I identify with a character because I'm sort of a historical bookworm, you might say. As a matter of fact, my wife has taken to calling me Milo in the household. So I'm the type of person where she'll ask me what time it is and I'll tell her now how to make a watch. The skills of the analytical mind, dissecting, how does things work? I mean, Milo could be a great animator if he wanted to. It makes me think that Milo is, in character, much the same type of hero that maybe Frank Capra had in a lot of his movies. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Meet John Doe. He is the little hero against the big world. In searching for what he looks like graphically, I remember surrounding myself with just tons of photographs of actors that I really admired in the cinema, spanning the last 8 decades. I'm getting little bits and pieces of ideas that start my imagination running in high gear. I put pencil to paper and just beginning working with shapes. After about 3 or 4 weeks of that, I've got maybe an array of about 50 different types of Milos in front of me. All of them a little bit different. All of them expressing a little bit different type of personality. So now's the time when I say, okay, can I have a meeting with the directors and Don and our art director, Dave Getz? And then they slowly start unpinning those and eliminating those that they don't think are quite Milo. And then through process of elimination, we boil it down to the one sketch that everybody likes. So once we had that one drawing, then I began to elaborate on that, doing more poses, more facial expressions, until we finally had what we thought was Milo. And now I turn out all the lights, I shut the door, I bolt it shut, put out the Do Not Disturb sign, disconnect the phone, and I get into the scene. And I struggle to get that first attitude drawing. And all I'm thinking of is movement and mass on the paper. And after several reams of paper, I get it. And suddenly Milo is born. You have something there that is a life pulse, a persona that's alive, living on the paper.
I propose that we find Atlantis, find that power source, and bring it back to the surface.
Rourke was another character I think we, in terms of a villain, wanted to do something different with.
I love it when I win.
Which was the idea, instead of making him the usual mustache-twirling bad guy, to give him a little complexity. To not make him inherently evil, but make him greedy and, to sort of, like try to create a 3-dimensional character as opposed to a 2-dimensional villain.
The first drawing I saw of Rourke was a Mike Mignola drawing of him. And then Chen-Yi Chang, who helped design Mulan, did a drawing, kind of made Mike's drawings a little bit more animation friendly. And then we started seeing the film, a rough cut of it. And it wasn't until I saw the story sketches of Rourke in the reels, and I thought, wow, that's kind of what I like. I like that look. I kind of pulled both of those and tried to make something in between. Because I think they both had elements. It's just a matter of finding the right ones that would work for animation. When I started on Rourke, I think the feeling was that I thought, okay, I got wowed by the idea of villain, it took me back to that whole idea that I'm going to be able to do some crazy, bad stuff with this character. And then getting into the film, I, quickly realized that, he's not going to be that kind of villain.
Nothing personal!
And it wasn't until near the end where, he really busts out and goes crazy, was kind of when I really got the chance to be that little boy, going through, just going, I'm just going to mess around and you're going to, get him, kind of stuff where you can get crazy with it.
Kida, she's obviously going to run Atlantis. She's very strong-willed. She knows what she wants. She has influence over her father. Very strong-willed. She's tough. She's cute. She's the whole package.
Well, it was written in the script that the Atlanteans were kind of a mother race, that they kind of were the original race, and that all other races and cultures evolved from them. And so, just as far as Kida's design and the Atlanteans in general, what we tried to do is find a mixture of different cultures and different races and put some of those elements in there. She's got white hair, but really dark skin. And I made her nose just a little bit wider than the average Caucasian girl. I didn't want her to look like the girl next door. I worked very hard to find traits that I thought were attractive. And one of the things I thought was attractive was these full lips. I think it's exotic, and it's also, even in our modern times, considered very attractive. When I looked at models in magazines and stuff, I noticed that a lot of them, no matter what their other features, had very full lips. We come up with ideas that are about her personality and how to play a scene, which with her has a lot to do with subtext, because a lot of her dialogue could sound very firm and maybe a little too stoic, and she could come off really one note if she wasn't played right. But what we've been able to do is find what's inside of and what's behind her words and the emotions that she expresses externally, to find the subtext in her relationship with her father. For example, she disagrees with her father's politics, and yet she cares for him. And so even as she's arguing with him, she's helping him to be comfortable and wiping his face with a damp cloth and dimming the lights and trying to care for him. There's a side of her that's very serious and passionate about her goals in life. But there's also another side of her, and that's a real playful side, and we see that part of her come out when she's with Milo.
I have some questions for you, and you are not leaving this city until they are answered.
Sweet, Dr. Sweet was a great character to draw because we wanted to make sure that we kept his personality at all times, because he was cool. I wanted him to be as cool as he could be through the whole thing.
Name Sweet, Joshua Sweet, medical officer.
Doc Sweet, one of the first African-American characters we've had in a Disney feature film, is animated by one of our first African-American supervising animators, Ron Husband. Now, Sweet moves totally different than anybody else. He has quick little accents. It was a wonderful contradiction, being he's the largest member of the team. He's huge, muscular, hulking, and this man is as fleet as can be. He moves so fast. And I think that's a nice little contradiction that Ron put into the animation.
But I was looking for something that had some appeal. Big guy, not a mean guy. So when you look at him, you don't want to be repulsed. He's a big teddy bear, you might say, because there was a lot of backstory in my mind as to who this character was. Well, he was educated because he was, it's one part in the film where he had been in university, but his actual medical training, instead of being on the cadavers or in the classroom, was out on the battlefield.
One day I'm studying gross anatomy in the classroom. The next, I'm sewing up Rough Riders on San Juan Hill.
He being a doctor, and this being a period piece, I wanted to make sure that the medical equipment and things that he was using would be contemporary with the time period. So I was in contact with a couple of archives. Howard University had an archive, as well as Virginia Commonwealth University. So I was in contact with them, and they sent me some pictures and Xeroxes of medical equipment that was in vogue during that period of time. His background is his dad being a Buffalo soldier, marrying a Native American, and he being produced from that union. So everything just sort of melted into fit as to who he was as a character, and then taking all that and designing that into the final character design.
The character Vinny was somebody, I thought, an explosives engineer who for a while, it was somebody who carried around a gramophone. So every time he was going to blow something up, he'd put a little opera on and he'd kaboom, he'd do it to opera. I mean, fun, weird, strange stuff like that. A lot of times you have ideas that just don't translate well to the actual physical production of a movie. So I'm thinking they got in and they thought, how can you have this guy carrying a gramophone around everywhere? It'll look a little strange.
So I had to go rethink
okay, how is this character going to move? How is he going to act? And I ended up thinking of him as a skinny guy in a turtle outfit. That's how I think of him. I mean, I think of him as actually a really thin guy underneath this big shell, like this real slow-moving turtle who does all his stuff. So that's how I approach it. And if you look at his neck, he's got this big cowl, and he's got this real skinny neck going down underneath it.
What else have you got in there?
Oh, gunpowder, nitroglycerin, notepads, fuses, wicks, glue, and paper clips, big ones.
Like I went and watched the Godfather movies, of all things, for looking for specific things of Italian actors. The way, you know the old stereotype, Italians use their hands. You look at any of the broad Italian actors, if you're pointing with your hand, your whole hand. They don't point with their fingers. And so it's like, so when Vinny comes up and he has to say, hey, what, and he's pointing with his entire hand, this way, that way,
Vinny was smooth as silk. Vinny didn't move a lot. If you ever noticed, Vinny, he did a lot of things perfectly still. His personality wasn't supposed to move a lot. And he had a lot of little gadgets on. And his bombs always had wires and everything with it.
And it's kind of like the Magnificent Seven, right? He's good with the knife, Well, he's good with the dynamite.
I only got about 10, plus, 5 of my own.
Anytime they need dynamite, TNT, nitroglycerin, he's got it. And he has a lot of it.
Hey, look, I made a bridge.
Helga was my tip of the hat to all those old 40s movies. The Platinum Blonde and all the Humphrey Bogart movies, this smoking, mysterious babe.
As a character, Helga was kind of the femme fatale of this group of explorers. She had to be Whitmore's personal assistant, so kind of this graceful person who took care of his business life and kind of a personal assistant, but also had to be a tough-as-nails commander when it came to going on this expedition. We also had an opportunity in Helga to create a character that was really from the comic genre. And that Paris studio gives us a tremendous chance to use a European group of artists like Yoshi Tamura, who is actually a Japanese animator who works in our Paris studio.
She looks like a James Bond girl first, so she has to be very sexy and very active and very strong girl. And also, she's a villain, so I tried to push her as a pretty woman, but very cold also.
Tell them to drop their weapons. Now!
Helga, I loved just because she was a tough woman. She was fun. She was difficult. The braid had a life of its own, and we had to make sure that the braid worked consistently all the time.
You said we were in this together! You promised me a percentage!
She was animated in Paris and cleaned up in Paris. So we had to make sure that she fit within the group of characters, because the rest of the characters were done here in Burbank, and we had to make sure that everybody fit.
Nothing personal.
Audrey was, again, just, I think, a desire to have a female character that was closer to Milo's age. And, the guys were, concerned about, well, we should have a mechanic person because these machines, they could bust down and all that sort of stuff. And I just thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to, to create a teenage girl grease monkey whose father, was like this hardcore mechanic, and she was kind of tough and from Queens or the Bronx.
I think it's in her blood. She just grew up with it, so it's second nature. And we're talking about 1914, so I think she's a little bit oblivious to some of the standards around her of the time, which would include being a female doing this kind of work, because there weren't a lot of mechanics running around in 1914 anyway, never mind female mechanics, never mind young female mechanics.
We're taking on water fast. I don't want to be around when it hits the boilers.
How much time do we have?
20 minutes if the bulkhead holds. You better make that 5.
I listen to the track a lot. By the time the scene is in my hand, in my office, I've already gotten direction and have some sense of where this piece fits into the continuity in terms of the acting and what's happening emotionally with the character. I sit in and just execute attitude poses mostly that I think will say the little icons of the scene, and then it's a matter of flushing things out.
Audrey Ramirez reminds me so much of Anne Marie Barnwell. Very feisty, very spunky, very full of verve, you know, and a very strong character.
2 for flinching. See ya, Milo.
Packard is the communications expert on this expedition, but to look at her you wouldn't know that because she looks like somebody's grandmother. She's sort of sullen, very low-key, a little acerbic, very deadpan.
Wow, I'm impressed.
Mrs. Packard was a Don Hahn invention. That he came to a meeting and said, I got this great idea for a character. How about this, like this old chain-smoking broad who runs the communications in the sub, but she runs it like, you know, the Mayberry RFD, you know, operator, or like the Lily Tomlin character. So we all just thought that was pretty funny.
She had a lot of gadgets. And the funniness of her personality was how still she was all the time. And her cigarette smoking, which I'm glad they let us keep in because it was part of her personality with that rough voice.
She just seems like the type that would have been pretty flamboyant in her day, but she's somewhat of a faded Gibson girl, you'd say.
Forget your jammies, Mrs. Packard?
I sleep in the nude.
A lot of her acting comes not from action, but more from finding that right attitude and then just maybe giving it a squint or a head tilt or something like that. And you can get so much out of one drawing. So basically, I spend my time on Packard finding that one drawing and then milking it.
Moliere had a lot of line mileage. Line mileage is how long it takes you to draw a character. Sometimes it takes an hour to clean up one drawing. And in the movie, there's 125,000 cleanup drawings. Moliere took a little longer because he had every gadget in the world on his head.
You have to stop the dirt! Dirt from around the globe spanning the centuries! What have you done?
Kirk and Gary, they usually give the animators a lot of leeway. You know, we worked on those early designs, realizing that he's, you know, the comedy character in the movie. They sort of said he's sort of like Pigpen, just dirty, little dirty guy, French Pigpen. And, you know, I was just thinking about how to keep his shape distinct from the other characters. We just wound up going real simple with, you know, just basically a real round head and this bullet-shaped body and, you know, just keeping him real animatable and fun so we could do a lot of slapstick, a lot of really broad, extreme expressions on him and attitudes. If you look at the design, most of the detail is really around the face with the goggles and the lamp and the little string on the lamp and the little crank. You know, most of the detail on the character is really just on his head. And Kirk and Gary said, well, he's sort of rodent-like, you know, he's the mole, so he has to be rodent-like. So I made sure I gave him buck teeth, you know, and kind of a mouth that's sort of like a mouse's mouth. Because it has sort of this triangular shape to it. But I wanted to make him look French because he's a French guy. And, you know, I was playing around with a profile with a real receding chin, and, you know, basically the face is constructed where the chin is way back here, and then the, you know, the thing that sticks out the furthest is this big nose. And I saw a picture of Charles de Gaulle, you know, this great shot of this profile of Charles de Gaulle, and I'm like, there's Moliere's profile. You know, he has a little mustache, the whole bit. So I put that up there, you know, on my board as I was drawing and coming up with the designs. Well, who else could be more French than Charles de Gaulle, right?
I remember coming in specifically with the idea of a cook who had, because it's such an interesting time period, you have people who, you know, could have participated in the settling of the West in 1912 and 13. So the idea of a cook being somebody who had cooked for General Custer on that fateful day and felt guilty because he thought it was all about, you know, the meal he'd served him. If I'd only cooked him.
I seen this back in the Dakota. They can smell fear just by looking at you, so keep quiet.
He literally is like a caricature of like all those Western sidekicks. Walter Brennan, Gabby Hayes.
When the role of Cookie first came up, it seemed like a good fit for Sean Keller because if you were to know him, Sean Keller is Cookie.
For the appetizer, Caesar salad, escargot, and your Oriental spring roll.
Don, Kirk, and Gary are just really neat guys, and they just wanted me to work on their film. They gave me the Cookie character because he's like this like old Western cook and like the old Western sidekick, and those are the types of films that I generally watch a bunch of times over and over and over again. And I guess they saw me acting in the hallways, just with my arms up and flailing about, and hey, maybe he'd be pretty good to do this silly character of ours here.
I got you 4 basic food groups: beans, bacon, whiskey, and lard.
So when the character of Whitmore knocked around, we thought, well, who's a quirky, funny guy that can do this character too? We all looked at each other and said, well, Sean, if we could clone him and get another Sean, he could do both characters.
They basically knew kind of what they wanted up front. Old, very old, ancient, eccentric, old guy with too much money in his hands that he knows what to do with.
We knew we needed a character, Mr. Whitmore, as it turned out, to send this expedition on its way. But he couldn't be an explorer. He was just a partner, a friend, an old college friend of Milo's grandfather, Thaddeus Thatch.
Did you really know my grandfather?
Oh, yeah. Met old Thaddeus back at Georgetown. Class of '66. We stayed close friends till the end of his days.
He was in the style of those great kind of Getty, Leland Stanford kind of robber barons who maybe was into logging and mining and construction and railroads and had all the money he needed. And now it was at the point in his career when he could just be a philanthropist and bankroll things that caught his fancy. And of course, one of the things that caught his fancy was this lifelong promise he made to Milo's grandfather.
I said, Thatch, if you ever actually find that so-called journal, not only will I finance the expedition, but I'll kiss you full on the mouth. Imagine my embarrassment when he found the darn thing.
The hardest character was the king.
The challenges I had, I think, the most on the king was his subtlety and age and so many different points of perspective. Like, he wants to say something, and to get there and say it, you know, it would be just all these little minute details to go, no. And that's it. He would speak Atlantean. It's just funny to be able to animate a different language and go, you know how to say that. You know what those mouth shapes kind of look like. To put together a sentence that you don't know what the words are, and you have to know what he's also saying. The king was tough to do because he's got more tattoos on his face, more hair on his cheeks and beard and mustache and all that kind of stuff. And he's got tattoos that go across his head as well as on his ears, so it was tough for a cleanup to do, and Marshall was the one that was doing it.
Never again do I want to do a character with tattoos. We had so much trouble. He's a wonderful character, and he's dying through most of the movie, but he had a tattoo, he was blind, he had a robe with every design in the world on it. To stay consistent with that character was difficult.
I heard somebody come in my office and say, "You rotoscoped that." I said, "No, I didn't. I didn't rotoscope a foot, let alone a hand, you know, or a mouth." Yeah.
That is all.
You really count up the number of people that it takes to make that ensemble work on the screen, and it's pretty extraordinary. Not only the number of people, but the kind of collaboration they have to make those characters live and breathe and exist, and ultimately to make you want to just believe that you're looking at flesh and blood, living, breathing characters. That's the goal of great animation, is to bring characters to life.
Say yach! Yach!
Head Slate, June 3rd, 1999, Walt Disney Studios, Stage B, DAT number 84, quarter-inch number 84A, sequence 5, AP 1551, take 1.
We're always looking for a way to make the dialogue sound more natural or more conversational or funnier or more interesting or unique to that character. And when you have someone like Michael in the room whose own personality is so unique, anything that he does to make the line more his just gives us a more believable character on screen.
When you're voicing, you do things that you don't get to do when you're acting. In other words, you don't have to worry about what you look like when you're trying to find the right emotion or the right reaction for a scene or for a moment, so that you can really kind of just contort yourself almost to get that noise, that sound that you want, or that reaction that you want. And it's a lot of fun. Thus enabling the kidnap and/or murder of the royal family. Not to mention personally delivering the most powerful force known to man into the hands of a mercenary nutcase who's probably gonna sell it to the Kaiser. Have I left anything out?
That was a difficult scene. Michael J. Fox gave an incredible performance. And so wanting to animate something that is worthy to his vocal performance and then takes it beyond was a real challenge.
He's got a quality to his voice, or it's like kind of a youthful exuberance. I mean, he's our age, you know. He's like 37, 38 years old. He still comes across, you know, real young and enthusiastic, which is a quality we wanted in Milo.
By the way, you know, we were never properly introduced. My name's Milo.
My name is Kida Gakash.
Kiramashaga. Hey, you got a nickname?
Kida. I've been doing cartoons since I was 12. But now I'm 30 years old and I finally get to work on a Disney cartoon. It's worth the wait. I have some questions for you, and you are not leaving this city until they are answered. A little headstrong, firecracker, very cool character. At first she's very curious about Milo. I'm sure he's really, really interesting, and I think he annoys her a little bit, and that kind of fascination, and then also annoyance.
Kida?
You do swim, do you not? What's up? You know how to swim or what?
I remember meeting Cree the first time. She kept me very off balance because she's a little bit wild. She's very playful and open, and it intimidated me a little bit, to be honest, when I first met her. And I realized, boy, that's Kida. When Milo first meets her, you know, Kida's intimidating. So I played on that.
If these outsiders can unlock the secrets of our past, perhaps we can save our future.
What they have to teach us, we have already learned.
Leonard Nimoy, he's so professional and deep, and he would go, so, he's 1,500 years old, okay? And he would change, and you could just, you know, it would smell moldy and dusty as he would go. He just had so rich character with this thing.
We vowed to eliminate all knowledge of the crystal and swore never to use it again. As it grew, it developed a consciousness of its own.
I'm watching him, and I'm looking at him going, wow.
Return to your people. You must leave Atlantis at once.
Oh, Your Majesty, be reasonable.
The voice of Rourke is James Garner, which is, you know, my mother just idolizes me now because James Garner's doing the voice. He does a great job.
It's kind of an irresistible temptation to use James Garner because he also has this, you know, great history of action pictures and westerns and war movies that he's been a part of. So this type of role and this type of movie kind of fits him like a glove.
I'd do it in a heartbeat. I know I'm forgetting something. I got the cargo, the crystal crew. Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's definitely an ensemble piece. It's always hard to do when you've got 10, 12 people that you're bringing together, so the directors did a wonderful job.
Mr. Whitmore.
Rourke.
John Mahoney does these just wild vocal peaks and valleys where he'll be speaking calmly about one thing for a moment and then
just turn on a dime.
Yeah, turn on a dime and be laughing like a maniac and, you know, doing yoga.
Finest explorer I ever met. Preston Whitmore.
Pleasure to meet you, Milo. Join me in a little yoga.
There's something so freeing and so much fun about doing voice work, and it just allows you to be so outrageous and so big, and you know, you constantly have it drilled into you that less is more. But when you're doing animation, you know, less is less, and less is boring, and more is much more fun, and it's great to just be able to blow that out. What are we standing around for? We got work to do.
But Mr. Whitmore, you know, in order to do what you're proposing, you're gonna need a crew.
Got them all, the best of the best. Audrey Ramirez. Don't let her age fool you. She's got more about engines than you and I'll ever know.
It looks like the rotor's shot. I'm gonna have to pull a spare from one of the trucks.
Can I?
No toques nada. I'll be right back.
She's tomboy. She's very in touch with her masculine side.
Yeah, thank you very much. Shut up.
So I think she thinks she could take him down.
For flinching.
She could, you know what I'm saying? So I think she likes to tease him and give him a hard time in the beginning. Am I in the right ballpark? I felt like a little kid again. It's great. It's like you pop in and do a couple hours and you just want it to go more.
Well, I took this job when my dad retired, but the funny thing was, he always wanted sons. right? One to run his machine shop, and the other to be middleweight boxing champion. But he got my sister and me instead.
What's Mole's story?
I am Moliere, and he loves the dirt.
What's it doing in my bed?
You ask too many questions. Who are you? Who sent you? Speak up.
Me,
When you find a character and a certain magic happens, and the character seems to just leap out of you.
Someone needs to talk to that girl.
I will go.
Someone with good people skill.
I will do it.
Someone who won't scare her away.
I volunteer.
Someone who can speak the language.
For the good of the mission, I will go.
It all works best for me when I'm just in a room with these wonderful people, and we're all enjoying ourselves, and I'm making funny voices and trying to throw myself into the scene and feel like I'm in this make-believe world.
Money. Money. Money.
I'm going to say, money.
Don Novello is a really gifted improvisational artist, and he's brought kind of a quality to this character that's very hard to describe because it's very much coming from Don.
Don Novello came in and read his lines. He would look at the sheet, and he would read the line that was written once, and he never read it again. And he just went off, and we never used the written line. We just used his improvs the whole movie.
He got turned on to explosives by having a Chinese laundry next door to his flower shop blow up one day. And this, this excited him.
I guess there was this leak next door of a gas or what. Boom! No more Chinese laundry. Blew me right through the front window. It was like a sign from a god.
This is Phil Morris.
Hey!
Hello, Phil.
Don.
How you doing,
Don?
Nice to meet you.
Vinny.
Phil's playing Dr.
Sweet.
Sweet.
I'm Sweet.
Okay.
Vinny.
And Vinny.
Vinny.
Vinny. Vinny in the same shot.
Phil Morris was, his voice delivery was very, very rapid fire. That was one of the challenges of keeping this character believable.
Nice, isn't it? The catalog says that this little beauty can saw through a femur in 28 seconds. I bet I can cut that time in half.
When he talks really, really fast, and we have to draw all those mouth movements, and it's not going this slow, it's going really, really fast.
Oh, no, really.
So, where you from? Really? I have family up that way. Beautiful country up there. You do any fishing? Me? I hate fishing. I hate fish. Hate the taste, hate the smell, and hate all them little bones. Little bones.
When he's happy, he's really happy.
Milo! I can't say it too loud.
When he's solemn, he's real solemn. There's no kind of middle ground with him. He's a very extreme character.
Oh, don't forget to eat the head. That's where all the nutrients are.
The magma has solidified in the bowels of the volcano, effectively blocking the exit.
I got the same problem with sauerkraut.
That's great. Now we have another alternate. I got the same problem with chipped beef.
Chipped beef.
We're gonna keep trying this till it's funny.
She's very cynical. We're all gonna die. And very secure, and she just feels that she does her job. And when she's not busy, she does anything she wants, including talk to her girlfriend on the telephone about recipes and things like that, and how to catch a man.
Milo James Thatch.
Who are you? How did you get in here?
I came down the chimney. Ho, ho, ho.
My name is Helga Sinclair. I'm acting on behalf of my employer, who has a most intriguing proposition for you.
Are you interested? I'd be. Sorry. She's rather sensual when you first meet her, and I like to think that she looks a little like Veronica Lake, but that's just me. She's quite striking, actually. I was pleasantly surprised when I saw her. I'd hate to, go through all this and find out my character's a toad, and be like, oh, great, that's how you see me.
The men need the 4 basic food groups.
I got you 4 basic food groups: beans, bacon, whiskey, and lard.
It's once in a lifetime you get to work with a comedian like Jim Varney, and I think when I think of Jim, I think he's not only a comedian that people know as Ernest or Slinky Dog, or now as Cookie, but what most people didn't know is he was this really smart, intelligent, sensitive man underneath this facade of wackiness. And it was sad to a degree that he didn't get a chance to see Atlantis as a finished film, but we did get a chance to show him clips along the way, and every time he came into the studio, we showed him little bits of what his animation was. And of course, he loved it.
That was really kind of sad, the fact that he knew that he was not going to be able to see this film before he has passed away.
Don't, baby, dance.
He did a bang-up job doing the voice work, knowing the fact that he was never going to see his last performance.
Kirk and Gary did a fantastic job bringing this great ensemble cast of voice actors that lent their spirit and their souls to the characters in Atlantis.
Maybe that's why they're into animation. Maybe it's just that childhood that they never quite gave up.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed working with all these people who were so good.
It's been a long time and a lot of work, but it's been worth it.
Or in this case, the blue carpet, for Atlantis. And I suppose we want to take the DVD viewing audience here because one of my favorite clips of early Disney lore is that shot of Walt Disney arriving at the Snow White premiere. And you know, we're dressed a little differently than he was, and the times are different, but it's the same feeling. You feel like you've worked for 4.5 years on a show, and here you are. The cast is here, the crew's here, and everybody's really excited about it.
This is really new to us, and we didn't used to get invited to these kind of things. So it's like we're walking around like the country cousins going, wow, look at all them movie stars. Look at all them cameras, golly.
It just really helps, because of the complexity of these types of movies, to have a core group of people who you really can communicate with and who are really sort of on the same wavelength as you creatively.
The whole collaborative thing, the whole idea of this many people working on one project is real interesting to me, and it's fun because I usually spend all my time squirreled away by myself in a room drawing comics. So to suddenly be thrust into a world where people are in meetings and it was almost like going back to art school.
I found in going through this movie that I actually learned so much that I had forgotten some of our basic concepts that we have gotten in our very first design classes when we go to art school, and realizing that it had so much to offer me personally as an artist. And I feel like I personally gained from making this movie.
I'm never going to have a first opportunity to supervise at Disney again. I mean, this was it. I honestly feel that if I'm working on another 8 movies here at Disney, I think I'm still going to be going, man, it was really cool working on Atlantis.
This movie made it feel like I had a family here. So it was something that I think 20 years down the road, I can still recall all the stuff that went through the movie. It's very good feeling.
To me, it's I don't know, it's everything about what animation should be about, and that is imagination. And it was cool. It was a pleasure to work on this film, and it was extremely difficult film, but I wouldn't trade a day of it.
I know I was 6'3" when I started this movie, and I'm 5'6" now. On a good day when I'm standing on a bucket, and I've lost time. I've lost those inches. What am I going to do? I'm not going to get them back.
I could go on for 3 hours about the kind of individual heroism of the creative team, but we want you to forget all that when you watch the movie. You want to forget the filmmakers. You want to forget the passion and the blood and sweat and tears that went into making the movie, and just forget that it's drawings at all, and be transported to this new place.
And looking back on this, it fits well into our portfolio of Disney movies because it's different, and it makes a big difference that it's there because it has to be there. You have to have a Snow White, you have to have a Pinocchio, you have to have a Tarzan, you have to have an Atlantis in there. It fits. It's the adventure that we haven't done yet.
We should go on and take chances in making movies that push the envelope in our techniques as much as in the story environment itself.
Atlantis is what can happen when you put baby boomers in a room who haven't grown up yet, wanting to make a movie that was a tip of the hat to our childhood, to the movies we loved growing up. That's essentially what Atlantis is.
My sister came down from San Francisco. She was visiting me, and she says, "Oh, John, we were cleaning out some stuff out of Mom's attic, and we found a whole box of something, and there was something interesting in it that I thought maybe you should have." And so she hands me this strange little parcel. It looks like the parcel that Whitmore hands to Milo. And I open it up, and inside it is my grandfather's journal. Now, he was in the French Army in 1905, but it's like, my goodness, life imitates art, or is it vice versa?
Your granddad had a saying.
Our lives are remembered by the gifts we leave our children. You know, it's such a wonderful message.
A lot of times when we are growing up, we immerse ourselves in the daily activities of life, the fetching and the laundry and the going to school and the kind of nuts and bolts of existence. And that's all really good. We have to have our lives. But somehow we cover up our basic fundamental desire to explore the unknown. And it's hard to do when you're living in a house in a suburb and your backyard's the size of a postage stamp. But you know what? Your backyard's a lot bigger than that. And I think if I had an ambition for this movie above and beyond the movie itself, it would be to open up in the mind of our audience, not just kids, but in all of our audience, the fact that your backyard is the cosmos. And there's no need to stop at your back fence. There's a huge world under our feet, a huge world at the bottom of the ocean, a huge world above our heads. And it's so instinctive in us to want to explore that world that it's almost our duty as human beings to seek out and discover that world and bring that exploration, that discovery back to enrich our lives in much the same way that Milo brings that sense of discovery back to his life. It's not just discovering Atlantis for Milo, it's discovering who he is.